The wind came off Lake Michigan in long, bitter sweeps, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Grand Hotel with a sound like something alive. Outside, Chicago had surrendered to the season. Snow fell in straight, heavy curtains, burying the parked cars on Wacker Drive, softening the hard angles of the city into something almost gentle. Inside the ballroom, none of that mattered. The Meridian Grand's main event space had been transformed. 2,000 square feet of floor shone like polished marble. Crystal chandeliers threw warm amber light across tables draped in white linen, across champagne flutes and name placards, across the expectant faces of the people who controlled the flow of capital in American technology. Investors, board members, journalists from the publications that shaped the industry's self-image. Everyone who was supposed to be here was here. The stage at the far end of the room was dominated by a screen the size of a shipping container. Veil Dynamics branding ran in slow rotation across it, clean, minimalist, confident. The company's product launch had been anticipated for 11 months. Leaked specifications had set forums alight. The financial press had run 3 separate cover stories. By every measure that counted in this world, tonight was the night. A man in a worn charcoal jacket stepped onto the stage. He had not been announced. He did not have a presenter's badge clipped to his lapel. His shoes, dark and scuffed along the left toe, made a quiet sound against the hardwood as he crossed toward the podium. He was not especially tall, not especially anything. He looked, to the assembled guests, like someone who had wandered in from a maintenance corridor. He touched the microphone. A woman's voice cut across the room, precise and cold as a blade drawn from cold water. "Get off this stage. Right now." The ballroom went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when someone powerful has decided to make an example. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone near the back stifled a laugh. The man looked toward the voice. His expression did not change. Then he looked out at the room one more time, as if searching for something he would not find, and stepped quietly away from the podium. The woman who had spoken was Cassandra Veil, 33 years old, founder and chief executive of Veil Dynamics. She was the reason these people were here. She was also the reason, in about 4 minutes, everything was going to go wrong. She did not know that yet. She did not know the man she had just dismissed in front of 200 people was the reason she would still have a company by morning. She did not know his name, in the sense that a name can carry weight, the specific, accumulated weight of what a person has done with their years. She knew only what she had seen. A man who looked out of place in a room built for people who looked like they belonged everywhere. That would be the last time she made that particular mistake. Ethan Walker had been employed by Veil Dynamics for 14 months. His official title was Senior Infrastructure Technician, Night Shift, which meant that on most evenings he arrived at the building after 7 p.m., worked through the quiet hours when the open-plan office was dark and still, and was gone before anyone whose name appeared on the organizational chart came through the front door. This suited him. He was 38, though he moved with a kind of deliberate economy that made it difficult to pin down his age. He kept his hair cut close, maintained a beard that was more neglect than style, and wore the same rotation of dark, practical clothing. He spoke when spoken to. He did not attend company social events. The security badge around his neck identified him by number more than name, and the overnight cleaning staff, the only people who consistently saw him, knew him simply as the quiet guy who always had coffee ready by 10 and left a second cup near the break room sink. What they did not know, and what the Human Resources Department had not thought to investigate with any rigor, was that Ethan Walker had not always been a man who fixed servers and replaced failed drives in the small hours of the morning. 5 years ago, he had been someone else entirely. He lived now in a third-floor apartment on the south side of the city, 12 minutes by train from the office on days he used the train, which was most days. The apartment was small and orderly. A kitchen that faced an alley. A living room where a child's drawings were taped to the wall with pieces of blue painter's tape so as not to damage the paint. A second bedroom where his daughter Sophie, 5 years old, slept with a stuffed rabbit named Gerald and a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. Sophie had her mother's eyes. This was both a source of quiet joy for Ethan and a source of a grief he had learned to carry without displaying. Her mother, Anna, had died 22 months after Sophie was born, of a fast-moving illness that the oncologists had been unable to arrest. The treatment had taken everything they had financially, and then some. The savings, the house they had been paying a mortgage on in Wicker Park, the small investment portfolio that was supposed to become a down payment on a better future. In the year that followed, Ethan had taken what work he could find that allowed him to be home with Sophie during the day and employed at night. He was overqualified for virtually everything available, which was a problem he solved by leaving large portions of his resume blank. The name Nightfall appeared nowhere on any document he possessed. He had entered the field in 2009, straight out of a computer science program at the University of Illinois, drawn less by the career prospects than by the puzzle of it, the way a well-designed network was both architecture and argument, a set of assumptions about how information wanted to move and how it could be constrained. He was hired by a federal contractor at 23 and spent 3 years doing work he was not allowed to discuss at family gatherings. After that, he went independent, which was both more lucrative and more honest about what he was actually doing. He was a consultant in the specific sense that people who understood the industry used the word someone organizations, called when the situation exceeded what their internal teams could manage. He had met Anna at a conference in San Francisco in 2014. She was a pediatric nurse from Minneapolis who had attended a panel on healthcare data security because her hospital had recently been ransomed, and she wanted to understand what had actually happened. She had asked the most precise question from the floor, and afterward he had found her at the coffee station and started a conversation that lasted, in one form or another, for the next 6 years. He had chosen, deliberately and with full awareness of what he was surrendering, to become invisible. It was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. Sophie needed a father who was present, not a reputation that drew attention. He had been done with that world, or believed he had been done with it. Most mornings, watching her eat cereal at the kitchen table and narrate a complicated drama involving Gerald the rabbit, he was certain of it. The building he worked in, Vale Dynamics' Chicago headquarters, a renovated manufacturing space in the West Loop that had been converted to office use, with the kind of aggressive minimalism that tech companies favored in the early part of the decade had, in those 14 months, become familiar to him in the specific way that places become familiar when you spend significant portions of your life in them alone. He knew the way the heating system cycled, the 2 elevators that could be trusted and the one that occasionally stuck between floors, the window in the secondary server room that did not seal properly and let in a thin, cold draft when the wind came from the northwest. He knew the building better than most of the 230 people who worked there during daylight hours. None of them knew him at all. Tonight, working his way through the network diagnostics, Vale's systems ran automatically before every major event. He had found something that suggested the world was not done with him. The anomaly appeared at 9:47 p.m., buried in a packet log that the automated monitoring software had flagged with a low-priority designation. Most technicians would have cleared it without a second look. The flag was the kind generated by minor timing irregularities. A misconfigured external sync, a noisy connection. Routine noise from a system running near capacity on a high-traffic night. Ethan stared at it for 11 seconds. Then he opened the raw log. What he found, reading through the traffic patterns with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, was not a misconfiguration. It was an intrusion in progress, specifically, a staged lateral movement through Vale's internal architecture, moving from a compromised third-party analytics endpoint inward, probing authentication boundaries with a sophistication that most commercial intrusion detection would read as background noise for at least another 6 to 8 minutes. He knew the signature, not because he had read about it, because he had spent 11 days in a server room in 2019 dismantling an earlier version of this exact toolkit back when the group using it called itself something different and operated out of infrastructure routed through 3 Eastern European jurisdictions. They had since consolidated, rebranded, and grown considerably more capable. The security community knew them as Black Helix. Ethan knew them as an organization that had once, briefly, considered recruiting him. He checked the time. 9:51. The product launch presentation was scheduled to begin at 10. Vale's new enterprise platform, the one that carried the personal financial data of roughly 400,000 business customers, would be formally demonstrated live on stage, connected to production servers, because the marketing team had decided that a live demonstration was more compelling than a recorded one. They were not wrong about the compellingness. Ethan tried the internal incident line first. He was put on hold. He tried the direct line for the IT manager on duty, a man named Derek who managed the daytime staff and had no idea Ethan existed. The call went to voicemail. He tried the general security extension. It rang 12 times. The event floor was on the other side of the building. He could hear the distant sound of the gathering voices, the particular acoustics of a large room filling with people. He had perhaps 5 minutes before the attack reached the production layer, possibly less. He closed the diagnostics window, stood up from his workstation, and walked toward the ballroom. Cassandra Vale had been told, by her executive coach and by 3 separate therapists over as many years, that her primary interpersonal challenge was the gap between her internal standards and her tolerance for other people failing to meet them. She considered this an accurate observation and a fundamentally unproductive thing to focus on. Her standards existed because they produced results. The results were Vale Dynamics. She had founded the company at 26, in a 2-bedroom apartment she shared with a former university classmate, on the strength of an insight about enterprise resource management that everyone she pitched found either obvious or impossible, and that turned out to be neither. By 30, she had secured her second institutional funding round. By 32, she had led a team of 240 people to build a platform that was, by third-party audit, the most secure mid-market financial data management system on the American market. Tonight was the culmination of a year of work she had personally overseen down to the feature level. She stood to the left of the stage in a charcoal blazer she had worn 4 times and a silk blouse she had worn once, watching her head of communications deliver the pre-show remarks to the assembled guests. She was aware of every element in the room. The placement of the journalists, the table where the 3 most significant investors were seated together, which she had arranged deliberately so they would talk and she could manage the conversation from a single position. The catering, which was running 3 minutes behind the original timeline, and which she had already flagged to the hotel events coordinator. She was not thinking about her IT infrastructure. She employed an IT infrastructure team for that. When a man she did not recognize walked onto her stage, on the most important evening Vale Dynamics had ever produced, she processed the situation in approximately 2 seconds and arrived at a conclusion that was entirely reasonable given the information she had. An unauthorized individual had somehow gained access to the event floor and was apparently attempting to address her guests. In the context of competitive corporate espionage, this was not an abstract concern. A rival firm had, 18 months earlier, hired someone to disrupt a competitor's product launch. She had read the case study. Her response was immediate, and she did not regret it. "Get off this stage, right now." She said it at a volume calculated to carry without shouting. The room heard it. The man heard it. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, not embarrassed, not defiant, something quieter than either, and then he stepped back and walked away. Good, she thought, and returned her attention to the stage. 40 seconds later, every screen in the ballroom went dark. The screens came back on 2 seconds after they cut out. What they displayed was not the Vale Dynamics product launch presentation. The main screen, the one behind the stage that had been cycling the company logo in slow rotation, now showed a single, rotating graphic, a double helix rendered in black against a white background, turning slowly at the center of the frame. Beneath it, in a clean sans serif typeface, a single line of text: "Your data is ours." Then the secondary screens along the walls began to populate, column after column of data account identifiers, partial records, fragments of financial information scrolling upward in what was clearly a staged display designed for maximum visible impact, not a full data dump. A demonstration, a proof of access designed to generate the kind of footage that would be looped on financial news for the next 72 hours. The room did not panic immediately, because people in rooms like this are trained, by professional conditioning, to assume that things which appear to be going wrong are in fact a technical hiccup being handled by someone whose job it is to handle such things. There was a long, brittle moment in which no one moved. Then a woman near the center table said quietly, "Is that real?" And the room understood all at once that it was. Cassandra moved. She crossed the floor to the AV console in 4 fast strides, where 2 technicians were already staring at their equipment with expressions of frank terror. Behind her, she could hear the ambient noise of the room, changing voices rising, chairs scraping, the particular quality of collective alarm. "What is this?" she said. "Not a question. We don't know," said the senior technician, a young man named Grant whose face had gone the color of old newsprint. "It's not coming from our systems. It's external, but it's in the system. It's displaying through our own. Can you stop it?" "We're trying." She turned to find her head of security standing behind her. "Get everyone away from the data terminals. Call the incident line. Get me whoever is on call for network right now." He was already on his phone. Cassandra scanned the room. The investors were standing. The journalists had their phones out. In approximately 90 seconds, this would be on the wire. She looked toward the door. The man in the worn jacket was still there. He had not left. He was standing near the exit, with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the screens with an expression that was not fear or confusion. It was something she recognized only because she sometimes wore it herself in a crisis. The focused calm of someone who already understands what is happening and is deciding what to do about it. Ethan had been 3 steps from the door when the screens cut. He had stopped. He had watched the black helix graphic appear. He had run the scenario through in about 4 seconds and arrived at a conclusion he already knew but had been briefly, foolishly, hoping to be wrong about. No one in this room was going to stop this. Not in time. The people at the AV console were infrastructure technicians. His counterparts on the daytime IT staff were event support generalists. The incident response team, assuming someone had reached them, would need a minimum of 12 minutes to get eyes on the system and another 8 to begin meaningful intervention. 20 minutes. Black Helix, with the access they currently had, needed perhaps 6. He thought briefly about Sophie, about the crescent moon nightlight, the rabbit named Gerald, about the fact that he had promised himself, sitting in an ICU waiting room 4 years ago, that he was finished with rooms like the one he was standing in. He turned around. He did not hurry. There was no point in hurrying. Speed in this situation was not about movement across the floor. It was about cognition, and cognition required steadiness. He walked back through the room, which was now loud with voices and the particular kinetic energy of collective uncertainty, and he reached the main technical console, a standalone unit to the left of the stage that managed the venue's integrated network interface, and he sat down. The CEO was approximately 6 feet behind him. He was aware of her presence the way he was aware of weather. "What are you doing?" she said. He did not answer immediately. He was already reading the console's access logs. "I'm going to try to get your system back," he said. A pause. "You're a technician. Night shift." He pulled up the network topology. "I need you to get everyone away from the stage terminals. All of them. And I need someone to physically disconnect the third-party analytics gateway." It's the gray rack unit in the secondary room behind the stage, and someone needs to unplug it from the wall, not shut it down through software. Can you do that? Another pause, shorter this time. She said, Grant, secondary room, gray rack, wall plug. Now. He heard footsteps behind him. He began to work. What Ethan did over the next 19 minutes was not particularly dramatic to observe. He sat at a console. He typed. Occasionally, he paused, read something on the screen, and typed again. Anyone watching would have seen a man working at a keyboard in the ordinary way that people work at keyboards, focused, unremarkable. What was actually happening was considerably more complex. Black Helix's intrusion followed a pattern he recognized from their 2019 iteration, but with meaningful refinements. They were not simply extracting data. They were executing a two-stage operation, in which the visible display on the ballroom screens was Stage 1. Designed to generate media coverage and reputational damage in real time, while Stage 2, running concurrently and invisibly, moved through the authentication layers toward Veil's production database. The display was theater. The data theft was the actual objective. He had cut their primary pathway when Grant unplugged the analytics gateway. That bought time but did not end the intrusion. They had a secondary access vector he needed to locate and close. He worked through the access logs methodically, following the pattern of their movement, the way you might follow tracks through fresh snow, each decision leaving a trace, each trace pointing toward the next. He found the secondary vector in the 7th minute, a legacy API connection that predated Veil's current security architecture, something that had been grandfathered through 3 system upgrades without proper audit, the kind of vulnerability that good security teams found in their quarterly reviews and that less attentive organizations discovered under exactly these circumstances. He closed it. There was a pause, measurable, brief, maybe 8 seconds, in which the activity in Veil's logs went quiet. Then it resumed from a third vector. They had anticipated a partial countermeasure. They had a contingency. He felt something he had not felt in a long time. The particular alert, slightly cold attention that came with realizing he was in a genuine contest with someone who knew what they were doing. Good, he thought, in the same tone he used when Sophie showed him a drawing that was actually good. He shifted approach. Instead of chasing their vectors one by one, he began building a dynamic isolation architecture within Veil's existing network, essentially constructing a quarantine around the production database in real time, using the tools available at the console and a working knowledge of Veil's infrastructure he had built over 14 months of overnight maintenance. It was slower than having root access to the full system, but it was what he had. At minute 14, the external activity changed character. It became more aggressive, faster, less careful. They were aware of the resistance now. They were aware, based on the nature of that resistance, that whoever was on the other side of this was not operating from a script or a standard incident response playbook. He could feel their adjustment the way a chess player feels an opponent leaning forward over the board. They shifted from their methodical, staged approach to something more direct, a brute force attempt on the authentication layer that was designed to overwhelm rather than circumvent. It was a different mind taking over, or the same mind abandoning subtlety. Either way, it meant they were concerned. He held the isolation architecture. It cost him something in terms of concentration. Maintaining a dynamic quarantine against an active push required continuous adjustment, each move generating a counter that required a response, and for a stretch of about 90 seconds in the 15th minute, he was genuinely uncertain whether it would hold. The console hardware was not designed for this. He was working at the limits of what the interface allowed. Then the push receded. They pulled back to reassess. He used the 15 seconds it bought him to reinforce the weakest boundary in the quarantine, the one they had been probing hardest. They came back and found it solid. At minute 16, it stopped entirely. Not a pause, a withdrawal. He recognized the difference. He sat back and looked at the screen. The main display behind the stage went dark for 3 seconds. Then it came back, clean, the Veil Dynamics logo rotating slowly in the amber light. As if nothing had happened, the secondary screens cleared. The ballroom's integrated systems came back online in sequence, the way lights come back on after a power cut, one section at a time. The room, which had been loud with alarm for the better part of 20 minutes, went quiet in a different way. Not the brittle silence of shock, but something more uncertain, more suspended, like a collective breath held pending confirmation. At the console, Ethan was not quite finished. He was writing a containment log, a documented record of the intrusion vectors, the steps taken to close them, and the forensic markers that would allow a proper incident response team to trace Black Helix's access pattern backward through the architecture. He wrote it quickly, in the compact notation he had developed over years of writing reports that needed to be readable under pressure, and when he was done, he saved it to a temporary file and left it open on the screen where anyone qualified to read it would see it. Then he became aware that the room was looking at him. Not all of it, but enough of it. The technicians at the AV console, several of the guests who had drifted toward the stage during the crisis, the head of security, who had ended his phone call and was standing with his arms at his sides wearing an expression that suggested he had just had a significant revision in his understanding of the evening, and Cassandra Vale, who was standing 2 feet to his right. He had not heard her approach. She moved quietly for someone who commanded rooms. On the screen in front of him, the containment log was open. At the top of the document, in the field where he logged his technician identifier, he had written the only name that would mean anything to anyone in the cybersecurity world who encountered this file: Nightfall Field Containment. Log. The 14th of October, 2023, 22:09 to 22:28. Cassandra looked at the screen. Then at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical expressiveness that people use when they want to be seen having a realization. It was smaller than that, a small, precise recalibration. Nightfall, she said. Not quite a question. It's what I used to go by. She said nothing for a moment. I know that name, she said finally. He looked at her steadily. Most people in this industry do, if they've been paying attention to the right things. You dismantled a ransomware network in 2020. 3 countries' law enforcement attributed the takedown to an independent operator they never identified, among other things. She looked back at the screen, at the log, at the evidence of what he had just done, and then she looked at the stage where, 19 minutes ago, she had told him to get off. Ethan stood up from the console. His back ached in the way that it ached when he had been sitting tensed over a keyboard for a sustained period. A specific tightness in the left shoulder that Anna used to address without being asked, placing her hand there when she walked past his desk, and which he now addressed by rolling the shoulder twice and ignoring it. The room was reorganizing itself around the change in atmosphere. The investors had sat back down. The head of communications was talking quietly to 2 of the journalists. Someone had restarted the ambient music, low, tasteful, the kind of thing designed to give a large room something to breathe against. Cassandra Vale had not moved from the space beside the console. The incident report you wrote, she said. Is that complete? It's a field log. Your incident response team will need to do a full audit. I've marked the vectors I closed, but there may be reconnaissance activity from earlier in the week that your logs captured. Look at the analytics gateway traffic going back 72 hours. I'll make sure they know. There's also a legacy API endpoint that needs to be decommissioned. It's documented in the log. That's the kind of thing that should be in a routine quarterly audit. A pause. It wasn't, she said. I know. She turned to face him more directly. This close, he could see that she was tired, not in a visible, disheveled way, but in the way that people are tired when they have been sustaining a performance of certainty for a long time, and something has briefly disrupted the performance. I owe you an apology, she said. He considered this. You made a reasonable decision with incomplete information. I made a decision without asking a question I should have asked. There's a difference. He did not argue with her. What I said, in front of the room, she began. It's done, he said, not dismissively. As a statement of fact, what matters is the containment held. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite gratitude, not quite assessment, something that partook of both. He understood, in that moment, something about her that he had not had the information to understand before. She was not someone who apologized performatively. The admission she had just made that she had made a decision without asking a question she should have asked was the kind of acknowledgement that cost something for a person like her, and she had made it anyway, plainly, without softening it into something easier to give. He found he respected that more than he would have respected a more elaborate apology. "Why are you working night shift infrastructure for a mid-sized tech company?" she said. It was a direct question. He respected directness. "It works with my schedule." "Your schedule?" "I have a daughter. She's 5. Night shift means I'm home in the morning when she wakes up." Something in Cassandra's expression settled, not softened, exactly, but arrived at a stillness that had not been there before. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Working here, I mean." 14 months. She nodded slowly, processing something. He could see her doing it, the rapid, ordered movement behind her eyes that was the actual work of a mind like hers. "You knew about the legacy API endpoint," she said. "Before tonight. I flagged it in a maintenance report 3 months ago. Standard protocol." It went to the daytime infrastructure lead. A very brief pause. "He's no longer with the company as of this conversation." Ethan said nothing. The product launch did not resume that night. By midnight, Vale's incident response team had arrived, a 4-person unit from the company's contracted security firm, none of whom had known, 2 hours earlier, that their evening would involve anything more demanding than a quarterly review call. They worked through the early morning, guided by Ethan's field log, tracing the intrusion backward through the architecture with a thoroughness that confirmed every marker he had identified, and added 3 additional indicators of reconnaissance that extended the timeline to the previous Thursday. Ethan stayed until they had enough to work from, not because anyone asked him to, because he had started it and it seemed right to stay until it was stable. Around 1 in the morning, he found a chair in a quiet corner of the now empty ballroom and called the woman who watched Sophie on nights when he worked late. Her name was Marlene, 61. Retired schoolteacher, who lived in the apartment directly below his and had, without ever formally agreeing to it, become the person his household depended on, in the way that households depend on people who are simply there. He apologized for the hour. Marlene said Sophie had woken up at 10, decided Gerald needed water, obtained water for Gerald from the kitchen, and gone back to sleep. He thanked her. She told him to drive safe and hung up. He sat in the empty ballroom with the phone in his hand and the distant sound of the incident response team talking through the secondary room wall. Cassandra Vale came back at 1:15. He had assumed she was gone, managing the investors, managing the press, managing the 17 cascading priorities that a security incident of this public profile would generate for a company of Vale's size. He had assumed, in the way he had learned to assume over the past 5 years, that his involvement was finished and would be acknowledged with a brief thank you and a return to invisibility. She sat down in the chair across from him, set 2 cups of coffee on the small table between them, and said, "The kitchen is closed, but they left the machine on." He looked at the coffee. "Thank you," he said. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. In the dim light of the half-cleared ballroom, with the chandeliers turned down to maintenance level, she looked less like a public figure and more like a person who had had a very long night. "I have a question," she said. "All right. If I had listened to you at the stage, how much of this could have been prevented?" He thought about it honestly. The display would probably still have gone up. They had already staged that component, but I could have started the isolation before they reached the production layer. The data they accessed, the demonstration records, The partial account information that was on screen, they wouldn't have had that window. They got partial records, not production. They got demonstration data. There's a meaningful difference in terms of customer exposure. She was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. No. Another silence. The kind that is not uncomfortable. I'm going to offer you a different position, she said. Head of Threat Intelligence and Infrastructure Security. It would be a new role. I'd be building the team around you. The compensation would be significantly different from what you're currently earning, and the hours would be day shift, which I understand creates a conflict with your current arrangement. She paused. I'm aware that may not work for you. I'm not making the offer because I feel I owe you something. I'm making it because you're the best person I've encountered for this problem, and the problem is real. Ethan looked at his coffee. He thought about Sophie eating cereal in the morning while Gerald the rabbit sat propped against the sugar bowl. He thought about what day shift meant in practical terms about Marlene, about the train schedule, about the school that Sophie would start in 8 months, and the logistics of school pickup. He thought about the last 5 years and the deliberate, careful architecture of the life he had built inside them. He thought about the feeling, at minute 16, when Black Helix had pulled back. I'd need to think about it, he said. I expected that. And I'd need to ask some questions about flexibility in the structure of the role. That's a conversation I'm willing to have. He looked at her. She was watching him with the same focused quality he had noticed earlier. Not impatient, not performing patience, but genuinely attentive in the way that people are when they are interested in what someone is actually going to say. I'll give you an answer by Friday, he said. She nodded. Friday works. He left the hotel at 2:20 in the morning. The snow had stopped while he was inside, and the city had gone through one of its periodic transformations. The streets quiet and white and reflecting the amber of the streetlights, the usual urban noise absorbed into the several inches of new snow on every horizontal surface. It was the kind of Chicago winter night that could almost convince you the city was peaceful. He walked 4 blocks to the overnight train, rather than calling a car. He needed the cold and the quiet and the simple physical fact of moving through the world at his own pace. He was aware, walking, that something had shifted. Not in the dramatic way that things shift in the stories people tell, not a transformation, not an illumination. More like a weight he had been carrying had been rotated slightly, redistributed, so that he felt it in a different place and could consider it from a different angle. He had told himself, for 5 years, that he was finished with the work that had made him Nightfall. He had believed this, and the belief had been useful, and he did not think it had been entirely wrong. Sophie had needed a father who was present. The work he had been doing before Anna died, the focused, solitary, high-stakes engagement with the infrastructure of digital threat, had not been compatible with being the person a small child needed at the center of her days. But Sophie was 5 now. In 8 months, she would start school. In 12, she would have a social world and a daily structure that did not depend entirely on him being the fixed point of it. And he was 38. He had, in the honest accounting of it, never stopped thinking the way he had thought tonight. The skill was not something you retired from. It was something you carried, and either you found a use for it, or it carried you somewhere you hadn't chosen to go. The train was mostly empty. He sat by the window and watched the city go past. The dark gaps between the elevated platforms where the neighborhoods were sleeping. The occasional lit window of someone else's sleepless night. He was not going to say yes to Cassandra Vale's offer simply because she had made it. He was going to think about it the way he thought about everything that mattered carefully, without rushing, with full attention to what it would cost and what it would change, and what it was actually asking of him. The conditions he would set were not complicated. He needed school hours to be accommodated in whatever schedule the role required. He needed the freedom to work remotely on the days when Sophie's routine called for it: sick days, holidays, the adjustment period when school started in the fall. He was not asking for anything extraordinary. He was asking for the acknowledgement that competence and availability were different things, and that a person could bring both to a role without being required to pretend they had no life outside it. Whether Cassandra Vale was someone who could accept that, he did not yet know. He thought she might be. She had listened tonight in the way that people who are actually interested in information listen, not waiting for their turn to speak, but tracking what was said and adjusting. That was a foundation, if there was one. But he admitted to himself in the quiet of the mostly empty train car, going to think about it. The apartment was dark when he got home. He let himself in without turning on the overhead light, moved through the kitchen by the light from the alley, and stopped in the doorway of Sophie's room. She was asleep on her back, one arm extended toward Gerald, who had migrated to the edge of the mattress in the course of the night and was in some danger of falling off. The crescent moon nightlight made the room a soft yellow-orange. Ethan crossed to the bed and repositioned Gerald against Sophie's side. She did not wake. She made a small sound and settled more deeply into sleep, the way children sleep completely, without reservation, with absolute confidence in the safety of the space around them. He stood there for a moment in the soft light. The world called him Nightfall. It was a name he had earned and carried and put down and, it appeared, not entirely left behind. It was a name that meant something in the specific, strange, high-stakes world of cybersecurity. It opened doors and closed conversations and had, tonight, made a sophisticated criminal organization decide that the cost of continuing was too high. But it was not what he was called in this room. He turned off the nightlight. Sophie preferred the dark. He was always forgetting and went to make himself a cup of tea and sit at the kitchen table for a while before sleep, the way he did most nights. Outside, the snow on the alley was still clean and unmarked. He thought about a question that a 5-year-old asked him. Sometimes, when the morning was slow and she was in a philosophical mood, "Dad, what do you do at work at night?" He had never quite known how to answer that. Maybe, he thought. He was getting closer. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, Ethan Walker sent a brief email from his personal account to an address Cassandra Vale had written on the back of a hotel note card. It said, "I have some conditions. If they're workable, I'm in." Her response arrived 11 minutes later. It said, "Send them. I'll clear my afternoon." He made 2 cups of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began to write. Sophie was in the living room, conducting a formal meeting between Gerald and a set of small plastic dinosaurs regarding some territorial dispute he had not been briefed on. Her voice was serious and patient and entirely certain of its authority. He listened to her while he wrote. Both things, he thought, were something he was good at. Both things, it turned out, were his. Outside, on the street below the apartment window, the last of the snow was beginning to soften at the edges where the morning sun reached it. By noon, it would be slush. By evening, it would be the gray, practical residue that Chicago made of winter, neither beautiful nor ugly, simply the city going on. He sent the email at 9:43 a.m. After reading it twice and deciding that it said exactly what he intended and nothing more. The conditions were laid out in plain language. Flexible start times, remote eligible days tied to school calendar, no travel requirement during the first semester of Sophie's schooling. In return, he would bring everything he had, and he was clear that he